Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first edition of Scottish Tenants News, the programme that covers housing questions, the burning questions facing housing schemes across Scotland, housing policy, and interviews some interesting people. And today in the hot seat, we have Ellenor Hutson. Ellenor has been a long-term community activist, and so we thought we'd start with her. So, Eleanor, do you want to tell us a bit about what you're doing at the moment in terms of housing?
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, I'm secretary of the Wyndford Residents Union. We have a few different things on the go. We are facing the demolition of um, some high flats and also a community centre. And we also have a campaign going on to deal with very high homeowners bills that have been levied on largely like quite elderly people with fixed incomes. So we have both of those things going on at the moment.
So, am I right in saying that you organise amongst all housing tenures?
Mhm. Yes, definitely, which I think is important. So when the residents' union actually comes out of a sort of residents association that we had that was there when I first moved onto this scheme, and that obviously was for tenants and homeowners and private tenants as well, just anybody that happens to live here. So we've kept that same thing, even though we've reorganised it to be structured like a union with dues paying. We don't make a distinction between the kind of tenure that people have. I think you can see it really clearly, in the kind of problems that we're facing. They're all problems of working class people, really, and there's no great. There are differences in experiences, differences um, in how people are experiencing living here and how people are experiencing the GHA, but it's nothing that can't be bridged within the union. Our interests are aligned closely enough to make that make sense.
So, you have a union structure with dues paying members. That's quite unusual in a kind of tenants association,
Mhm.
tenants and residents association context. Can you tell us a bit about why you went for that sort of approach?
Okay, the checkered history of Wyndford Residents Union. So when I first moved in here, we had a straightforward residents association. I think that you had to pay just once and then you were in it forever. And it was a very low payment that you had to make. So I mean that's great in some ways, but it had like two main drawbacks. Like firstly, it meant that we were actually reliant on the landlord for funding for really basic things like having a laptop or
Mm.
like booking a room. Um, and then secondly, it meant that it was quite difficult to kind of keep track of who you had and keep them involved.
Mhm.
So it felt very much like the people in the residents association were just those people that felt like turning up to meetings.
Mhm.
Um, I remember we did have like quite a small activist base at the time. Um, so anyway, we quite soon after I moved in, we always sort of aspired to be more union like, I suppose, and we wanted to take up people's individual cases and wanted to hold the GHA to account, wanted to talk to them about repairs and things like that. They responded like really badly to it. They didn't have to. They could have been a bit more chilled out and just negotiated with us, but instead they chose to freak out a little bit and deregister us. And so then the decision that we took then was that we were going to need a bit more kind of discipline and accountability um, from the members,
Mhm.
so that we could fund ourselves, and so that we could build an activist base. And so we wanted, to have everybody pay dues. The dues are very low. It's £3 a month if you're in work, and it's £1 a month if you're unemployed or if you are retired. So it's not a great deal, but I do think it's important for people just to sort of like show that little initial level of commitment. And it also gives us a little bit, enough money to book a room or print some flyers or something when we need to.
And I'm sure a lot of viewers will be familiar with that kind of tension between the landlord and the registered tenants organisation. Obviously, when the 2001 Housing Act came in, they had intended for registered tenants organisations, at least from the perspective of the tenants movement at the time, to be a bit like union recognition. But it hasn't really worked out that way in a lot of communities. And I think that the experience of the Wyndford certainly speaks to some of that. But obviously, you're not from the Wyndford, Ellenor.
No, I'm not.
You're,
I'm from Essex, so originally.
And I gather, you have experience of living in council housing, growing up in Essex, and
Yes. So I grew up on a housing estate in Colchester. Grew up on, if any Colchester people watching, grew up on Greenstead. It'll mean like nothing to the vast majority of you. But there may be some Colchester people who are like, oh. And then I moved to London as a young adult. And London is, oh my gosh, a whole nother ball game as far as housing is concerned. It's pretty much dystopian. There's more or less no social housing, or a very very small number of people still in social housing. But then, if you're homeless in London now, they will ship you out to the back of beyond. It's very very difficult. Everybody's private renting. The rents are extremely high. You will be paying the majority of your wages on rent universally, and it didn't bother me at first when I moved to London, because when I first moved to London there was still like a kind of squatters movement. So I was living in squats, but eventually when I sort of wanted to settle down, have a bit more of a stable life, I was in the same situation as everybody else, like paying like the majority of my money each month towards rent, and basically like living at a benefits level type subsistence, even though I was working, I would say fairly good jobs, and that's how the economy in London is. It's like it's really um, kind of deformed almost by the extremely high rent. So you have people who in Scotland you'd expect to be doing quite well for themselves are living more or less at benefits level. People who are you have people sharing beds, like one on the night shift, one on the day shift, like swapping over. You've got like a lot of families that don't get to see each other because of the cost of rent. So you have like it's in some communities it's very normal for the man and woman to work opposite shifts and only see each other on the weekend.
mm-hmm.
That was like in the Latin American community. That's extremely normal to arrange it that way. It's just very dystopian. And one thing, when I came to Glasgow, like a lot of things surprised me about Glasgow, and in some ways, like the sort of entrenched generational poverty in Glasgow was though I'm from quite a poor area in Essex, the entrenched generational poverty in Glasgow was a shock to me. But one thing that was also a shock to me is that the standard of living of somebody who does have a job in Glasgow
Mm-hmm.
is much higher. And I went around, for the first couple of months being like a bit surprised that people could sort of afford Christmas presents or taxis or to run a car or to have nice clothes, things that people take for granted. Like,
So, I mean, obviously, you're talking about what you've described there as, I think the phrase you used was dystopian. I gather it wasn't always that way. Do you have any insights into what changed the situation for housing down there, and why? I mean, it seems to have happened in your lifetime, really. With you grew up in the council estate, but then
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think in London and the southeast generally, it probably I don't know. Sort of this happened like sort of during my childhood, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's the oil money coming into the city of London and the deregulation of the city, and that kind of like kind of like the financial services.
Undoubtedly, but what do you think happened to council housing?
Well, yeah. I mean, so well, the obvious thing that happened to council housing is the right to buy.
Mm-hmm.
So, but in the southeast, it really was. It's been a nightmare of a policy everywhere. But in the southeast, I think it's been a perfect storm,
Mm-hmm.
because you have this situation where anybody can buy their council house, and then that house is like out of circulation for social housing
Mm-hmm.
afterwards. And I think, in the Wyndford, we're still in the kind of situation where homeowners are mostly elderly people that have lived here their whole life.
Mm-hmm.
But that changes, and the next iteration is that the people that own the houses are buy-to-let landlords.
Yeah.
And eventually as time goes on, the a housing estate that was like completely social rent becomes completely private rent, and you have the same demographic of people, but they're all paying like far more in rent. And so that's the situation that's happened to council housing generally.
Do you have any examples of that?
I mean, yeah, the examples are all. I mean, examples are around us here on the Wyneford. We have several members of the branch who are living in uh, flats the same as I'd live in, but are paying very high rents because somebody, a buy to let landlord owns their flat, and then that's it's gradually becoming more and more sort of private lets, even
Mm-hmm.
here. Um, but I think the thing that's different in Scotland is that Scotland sort of put an end to it.
Mm-hmm.
Scotland said, like, okay, this far and no further. We've lost a lot of social housing, but we're not going to allow people to do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think in England you're still allowed to do
Yeah,
the
I
right
gather
to
you are.
buy.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
I recall a long time ago when Boris Johnson's on his way out as Prime Minister, but
mm,
back when he was the Mayor of London, his housing deputy he opined that their agenda was to turn council housing from the hospital it is now
mm.
to the ambulance of the future. And I'm conscious of maybe anecdotes you might have had about going to see a flat in a council estate and finding that there are no council houses.
Oh yeah, that's really. I mean, it's really common in London. If the housing estate is like well designed, I mean, I think there's one like particular one in Camden that was like designed by a particularly kind of well thought of architect.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all private now. It's all homeowners are private.
Yeah.
And that's why if you become homeless in London, they will send you way out. I mean, sometimes like not even like to Essex or Kent or places surrounding London. Sometimes as far as like Manchester or Birmingham or something, which is devastating for somebody who needs the support of like their family and their friends.
Yeah.
Which most of us do. Let's face it.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting you mentioned Camden because they have a really strong tenants and residents movement there comparatively for London. They've got offices there, and it's also where the London Tenants Federation work out
Mm.
of. But you weren't really involved so much in the official tenants and residents movement, were you, Eleanor? You were doing something quite different, but related to housing.
Yeah, so I mean, we were like, I guess, in a way, like kind of sort of reinventing the wheel, in a way. I was involved in an organisation called LCAP, which was London Coalition Against Poverty, and we were like very inspired by the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, um, which did like a kind of like a thing that they call direct action casework, which
Mm-hmm.
is similar to sorts of things that say Living Rent are doing now, where you have somebody that's facing a problem and you do the general casework of like negotiating and writing emails and so on. But you would sort of like also combine that by maybe doing a demonstration or something,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe like bombarding the office with kind of like jamming the fax machine, jamming the phone lines, like
Mm-hmm.
those sorts of actions. And so we were like trying to do that in London as well. We did like some good campaigns around homeless housing and things like that.
So, what sort of lessons do you draw from from that period of activism.
That's interesting. I mean, the obvious one is that, like, I remember one thing when we did on in Hackney in the temporary homeless accommodation there, and they had left this flat without. It was pretty awful. They'd left the flat without a front door.
Wow.
Yeah. So, like, obviously, like, what should have been there would be like a proper kind of big heavy duty, door like you'd have on a block of flats, right? Like a proper security door. And then inside the block, everybody just for their flats just had like little, plywood doors, just wooden doors, right? And what had happened is that the front door had broken and they hadn't replaced it. So in effect, I mean, this is Hackney. It's like known for like being quite a dangerous place. Like it's not, when they say like, oh, people leave the front doors open, right? Mm-hmm. It's not one of those places. But in effect, people were forced to leave their front doors open because because there was just a little bit of plywood between you and the outside world. And what had happened is that people people, rich people, like rich, wealthy men, right, had taken to picking up prostitutes and taking them to the flats, and and having sex with prostitutes in the stairwells and in the lifts. And this is like in temporary accommodation with people like very small children. It was really, really appalling. But we did a campaign about it, and we didn't even have to get as far as doing a demonstration. Just when Hackney Council heard that we were planning to do a demonstration, they immediately put a security guard on the door. Mm-hmm. And then they immediately, pretty much as soon as they could arrange it, they had a security door in place, and that was after just neglecting it for several years.
Yeah.
So what I learned from that was that it's just like they do not expect tenants to fight back.
No.
And when tenants fight back, they're flustered, and they don't understand it, and sometimes they cave very easily.
Yeah.
They're just frightened that it happened at all. So the other thing that I learned from it is like obviously. Is that I learned a bit about the nature of the sex industry, in London, because I really didn't know very much about prostitution. I hadn't really sort of kind of come face to face with it, and it was very clear when you do actually see what's going on, that it's not a glamorous mm-hmm. thing. It's not something that should be tolerated. Like. Mm-hmm. It certainly shouldn't be tolerated in residential places, like yards away from children's bedrooms.
Yeah.
But actually, it shouldn't be tolerated anyway, because you could see, really clearly that it was like extremely arrogant, privileged men raping very ill, vulnerable women.
Yeah.
In a place where families were living, it was. It was disgusting, and so that was like the other thing that I really learned was that like it wasn't the main point of the campaign or anything, but it really hit me quite hard that it's not okay. It's not something to be tolerated in our communities.
No. I mean, that example speaks to so many different intersecting kind of considerations, because one, you've got the authorities will give as bad a job as you let them away with.
Yes.
If there is no organisation there to represent people, then you get treated like mushrooms.
Yeah.
And my own background in tenants activism can give some examples of that. But then you've got the other aspect of when you have a precarious housing system, who loses? Women and children. And obviously homelessness figures bear this out. It's who is in the most precarious of housing position is women who've suffered at the hands of bad bastards, basically.
Absolutely.
So that's obviously a big portion of Scotland's housing need. But you moved on from there, and you've been in Scotland what, dozen years or something now?
10, 11 years.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So your background is as a welfare rights advisor,
Yeah.
and you've done a range of jobs.
Yeah.
What kind of what kind of observations do you have on housing scheme life?
Oh, that's a very broad question.
Deliberately broad, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I like living on schemes. I like so many things about living on schemes, especially this one because I've got really good friends here, and the scheme itself is like really nicely laid out. Like I like it that you can like look out of the kitchen window and you can see the kind of back court area where the kids are playing, and that like the whole thing is designed really nicely. So the masonettes are built around a green area, and it's obviously that the person that designed this. I don't know who the architect is, but the person that designed this, but I put quite a lot of work into making it like human sized and livable.
Mm-hmm.
It's really nice. So it's like, and I think my kids are having like a really good childhood here because it's designed like that, because there are play areas, because it's designed so they can easily call on their pals, because there's it's safe to walk to the shops on an errand. They have like a lot more freedom than I would be able to allow them other places. So I mean, it's got its ups and downs, hasn't it? It's got like it kind of is what it is. You have to put up with like some stuff that maybe middle class people wouldn't put up with. But on the whole, I do like a scheme, and obviously the more organised we are as tenants and residents, the more we can deal with any problems that come up, right? And we have had some like fairly serious problems of antisocial behaviour on the Wyndford. Don't want to sugarcoat the experience, but because we're organised in a tenants and residents union, we have been able to make demands on the council and on the police for investment, for dealing with street valium, for situations that come up. We have been able to tackle. Certainly more so than in a comparable area that's not organised. So,
yeah. I'm interested in what you had to say about street valium there. Obviously, that has been driving the huge wave of drug deaths, and Scotland as a country has, in terms of the number of people in the country, per head, the highest drug deaths in Europe. So obviously, it's a huge problem. Do you want to talk us through what was going on?
So the local shop, Bill's shop, it always kind of has teenagers hanging around outside. That's been the case since the scheme started in the 1960s, so it's not unusual. But the problem was that there were like several dealers moved into nearby flats and really started exploiting the youngsters that were hanging around outside the shop, kind of like drawing them into becoming dealers, which would obviously be disastrous for those individual young people. As much as they were antisocial and a problem and annoying, we still don't wish for their lives to go down that particular path.
Yeah.
And with the violence as well that comes with like organised crime, was like a worrying time, because you could kind of see, well, it's all kind of fairly functional now, but this is the sort of situation that deteriorates fast, So we had the dealers sort of attracted by the fact that there was youngsters hanging around, and then the youngsters brought in to act as part of that operation, and then obviously street valium is extremely dangerous. Probably, like, did you say that it accounts for like more drug deaths than anything else?
I think the big factor is etizolum, which is a barbiturate drug, much stronger than Valium.
It's quite easy to overdose.
I think it's a bit sort of, if you remember, the Michael Jackson thing, dying of fentanyl, because an opiate was far stronger than heroin. Etizolum is to Valium what fentanyl is to heroin. It's just an extremely powerful and cheaply produced drug.
Yeah, it's obviously not something that we want in our communities. But because we were organised and we did have a tenants and residents union, we were able to put pressure on the council and on the police, and we found out that there was like a scheme that GHA does for its like most kind of worst hit areas with antisocial behaviour. And it was a really nice scheme. It was really good. It's a shame because the lockdown happened very soon after they implemented it. So I don't think they were able to do like about half of what they might have liked to do. But it was like a kind of joint working between the housing association and the police, where they I think they do kind of like take a targeted approach to enforcing the law and dealing with things through the criminal route, the criminal justice system. But they also, as part of it, did this whole thing where they like tried to improve fire safety in the high flats. They tried to encourage people into work. I was like initially quite skeptical about that. I remember sitting in this meeting room and the guy from this particular scheme was like talking us through how how badly some areas of the scheme were scoring on the index of multiple deprivation. And he said, we're going to change that. We're going to kind of like improve it and make it so it's not multiply deprived anymore. I don't know, for people that don't know, like you kind of you score multiple deprivation on like a number of like things like facilities and area and employment and education and health, and crime is one of them, right? And so I remember saying to him, well, we're gonna like make it go down the index of multiple deprivation by dealing with crime, are we? Because obviously we don't have any kind of way to improve the employment, for example. And the guy said, oh no, we can improve employment. He's like, look, we're zeroing in on just this tiny little area. If we get like 5 or 6 people like apprenticeships, then yes, the stats will go up. And I remember like just being really impressed by that. I was like, oh yeah, okay. And the stats are like, I don't want to say like the stats are everything. It's like you're having a terrible time, but like, you're now a 6 instead of a 7 or whatever. I want to like kind of like make out that like making the number change is all we're concerned about.
Rise at league tables.
Yeah, just rising in the league tables. Yeah, but I think it did show me that it was like actually no, we're going to like really, really focus on it, and we're really going to try and change the experience of living in here in like multiple different directions. And I was like, and it is a shame that the pandemic happened and like a lot of that, kind of probably didn't happen. But we no longer have an etizola problem on the scheme. The bill shop is much safer. It's much easier. Like you feel much safer going shopping these days. It's much more welcoming there.
So a success then.
So a success, yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
It's interesting what you talk about with the index of multiple deprivation, because obviously most housing schemes will be towards the bottom quintile in Scottish society, partly because of the way that allocations have worked. You get social housing, access social housing, public housing by points, and you have the points because you're in severe need, and you're in severe need because basically you want a bob or two. So that's a change, obviously, from when the scheme that you live in would have been built, where it wouldn't have had that kind of allocations policy.
Oh no, I mean, I think it had the opposite allocations policy in the past. You had to go for an interview, and it seems like it was always the women that attended the interview, and you would have to turn up at the interview. You would have to prove that your man had a job, and then you would have to like somehow be interviewed to see how respectable you were. I think it'd be fascinating to talk to an older person about like what exactly would sort of qualify you as respectable, because I'm sure like some of it now would be like would seem a bit regressive.
Of its time, perhaps.
Of its time, yeah.
But I think it also speaks to the kind of dual power that tenants had between them and the public authorities, almost like a closed shop in a workplace.
Yeah.
And in an ideal world, we would return to that level of power. but we need to get organised. But talking a bit about the multiple index of multiple deprivation, I gather the Wyndford is very undeprived in one aspect.
Oh, well, yes, this is extremely interesting. This is why this is in a nutshell like why we're under threat. If you look at the index of multiple deprivation, we are the lowest decile, so the lowest tenth for everything, everything, like for health, for employment, for education, for crime still, unfortunately, although it's improving, or everything except for one thing. For
And just the lowest decile, that's bad, right?
That's the worst one.
It's a bad one, right?
Yeah, that's the worst one. Yeah.
Right.
So like, but we've got so we're scoring like ones or zeros like for all of that, but then we score a 9 for facilities and location. So what that means is that we are, the the poorest people on the richest land, right?
Right.
We are like sitting on land that has an enormous location, right?
Yeah.
We're sitting on land that has an enormous value, and the GHA absolutely loves to borrow on land values, and the council, who owns like a little bit of the land that the community centres on, they absolutely love to sell off land to deal with their debts, of which they have many. That's the background, right? That's the reason that they're looking to move people out, demolish high flats, knock down community centres, and it's absolutely essential that we fight them in this because we deserve to live somewhere nice, right? We deserve to live somewhere with facilities. We deserve to live somewhere that is near a park. We deserve to live somewhere that has a big Tesco's. We deserve to live somewhere that's on a bus route into town, right?
Yeah.
We need it more than middle class people, actually, right? We need these things, and we don't want the high flats to be demolished and all of those people move to comparable flats further out of the city.
Yeah.
Which is where I think many people will end up. There's a lot of talk about the high flats being unpopular. This is probably true, for some people. There's certainly antisocial behaviour in the high flats. However, the end result of this is people living in comparable flats somewhere where the location is not so good.
Yeah.
Yeah. If it was that terrible, the middle classes wouldn't want it.
Yeah.
But they want it.
Yeah.
They can't have it. It's ours. Why we're holding on to it.
Well, it seems like there's two processes that we might have said were things of the past going on here. You've got one, stock transfer. The GHA have taken this scheme, taken control of this scheme in recent times.
Yeah.
And then you've got mass public housing demolition. And those were two big things that were going on in the mid-noughties, when they were trying to privatise all the housing stock.
Yeah.
And if I remember back in the time, the goal for Gordon Brown, who was driving this process at the UK Treasury, was he wanted to take public housing out of the public finances. He wanted to take the borrowing away from the state and say, well, this isn't government borrowing anymore. And that's partly what the PFI and things were about as well. But he wanted to move that way. But he had this other objective, which was to have public housing, now social housing, be funded from the banks and the private sector. And it's kind of unusual in that largely hasn't happened. It didn't work. But the GHA's made it work. And they've I might have some of the details on this wrong, but my understanding is through their Wheatley group, because of the sheer amount of assets they own, they've taken control of the council housing, former council housing in Dumfries and Galloway. They've eaten up all these housing associations, Dunedin Canmore and Cube Housing Association and Lowther Factors. And they've used that huge asset portfolio to say, give us a bond, just like a government treasury bond, to say, we will pay you back 5% in 25 years, which basically means we printed money. And unlike other housing associations, they now have loads of money. So do you think that, you talked about the location, do you think the GHA's intent here is demolition to rebuild, or what do you think the GHA are trying to do?
It's hard to tell, right? Because obviously they have told us that they plan to rebuild. They don't seem very clear on what they plan to rebuild. They haven't shown us pictures of it. They haven't given us a layout. That in itself is a little bit suspicious. We know that other areas around the city have been left empty for a very, very long time. If they do rebuild, it's going to be a large proportion of it is going to be mid-market rent, which is a bad and insulting thing that we should like hold out against.
It's a really strange term. It's like a, what do you call it? Like Orwellian, because they say mid-market rent, which makes you think, oh well, that must be people in the middle, right? But
no.
you have to be earning quite a lot of money before you can move into mid-market rent.
Yeah, I mean, mid-market rent is it's stuff that's owned and run by housing associations, but they can charge you up to 75% of the average
Right.
rent for the not even the rent for the area, was it? Or
how they pick it?
How they pick it. But anyway, that's quite a lot, right? That's quite a lot. So they're talking about making 2 and 3 bedroom family homes. So that will be like 75% of that average for that is going to be nudging £1,000 a month. So it's obviously
silly money.
It's not for it's not for people around here. But the thing that I find the most offensive about it is that council housing is supposed to be for everyone. It was always supposed to be for everybody. I think the idea was that it would replace private renting, or it would act as like a downward pressure on private renting by providing something that was better. The idea was it was going to be universal. It was going to be for people like on very low incomes, but it was going to be also for like middle class people, certainly lower middle class people. Maybe I think the aspiration would, middle of the middle class even. I don't know if middle of the middle class ever was that excited by the prospect.
Well, no, I have it on good authority from people like a good deal older than me that, they would live alongside GPs and, people with high-powered jobs.
Well, that's how it should be. That's how it should be, I think. It should be like that. Everybody should be having the same, living in the same sort of accommodation, experiencing the same sort of things. That's how you build like unity amongst people. So anyway, that is council housing. That is what it's supposed to do, right? So the idea that you can invent a new sort of council housing for people who have a good job is outrageous and insulting, right? No, it's not okay. It's just a way of it's similar. It reminds me of when you go to the supermarket and then you got your Tesco's basic version or something, right? And then you've got your just middle of the range Tesco's thing, and then you've got your Tesco's finest, and it's basically it's the same thing tweaked a little bit. Yeah. Because what they don't want is people that can afford Tesco's finest buying Tesco's basic. Right, they just want to segment the market so it's not so that they get the maximum possible amount of money out of everyone. If you only have a little bit of money to spend, then they'll get that. But if you have more, they'll get. It's
commodified, isn't it?
It's commodified, and that's what they're doing with the housing. They're like, oh, some of you have got jobs. You can have the exact same housing, but you can pay much more for it.
And of course, because you have to earn a certain amount, you can't lose your job.
It's a disaster if you lose your job. So I've dealt with cases like this. I dealt with a very sad case actually. A young couple with 3.
This is when you were in welfare rights.
Yeah. This is not here. This is elsewhere. So a young couple with 3 disabled kids, and the mother had to give up her job in order to get to all of the appointments, the medical appointments the children had, and they struggled to catch up with the rent. And this was the first time I'd come across mid-market rent, and I very naively thought to myself, well, it's a housing association. I know how to deal with housing associations when people are in rent arrears. We'll ring them up and offer a little bit extra per month to deal with the arrears, and they'll be all right about it. Not a bit of it. No. Don't have housing officers. They don't have welfare people. They don't have people that would help you in that situation. What you have is somebody saying, well, if you can't afford the rent and you're not in work, perhaps mid-market rent is not for you. So people have to understand this when they go into mid-market rent, that if you have some kind of misfortune in your life, they will turf you out as quickly as a private landlord would do. And and you have these like organisations that were set up to do social housing that that we like. Obviously, we have a residents and tenants union here for a reason, because they don't always do what they should do. You need to be held to account. But with mid-market rent, there's they've just torn up the rule book. They're just like, no, we're not doing this at all. We're going to be a social housing provider that behaves like a private landlord.
And of course, you generally get private tenancy.
You do get a private tenancy. So, I mean, like, one thing that people like about it is that you get it decorated and you get your white goods and stuff. So it comes to you in like a slightly better condition than social housing sometimes does. But they behave towards you as though they're a letting agency.
Yeah.
And so we don't want that. We don't want that on the Wyndford. We want it to remain social housing. We want the social housing to be available to everyone, whether they have a job or not.
Mm-hmm.
Don't want people to charge more just because they've got a job. We want people to, actually, be able to enjoy their wages and use their wages to like improve their lives, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's what we want. And we want people who, to get a sympathetic hearing if they are having a hard time finding the rent.
And of course, this isn't the only pressure facing your community, is it? There's other things going on around your part of Glasgow.
Yeah. So there's like several bits of kind of. Are you talking about the Ellenor Street and so on?
Yeah, vacant land and obviously what's happening on the Greenbelt land. It seems that issue of location is biting you in the arse again.
Yes. So we do have areas like Ellenor Street where social housing has been demolished, and the council are now seeking to sell off that land because the council is financially in difficulties. So our demand for that is that whenever social housing is demolished, the land must be used to build new social housing. Because they always have a reason, right? They always have a reason. They always say like, like at the moment they're saying like, these flats they're not suitable for modern living. They're not what people want. They've got problems. We're tearing them down because of the problems, But you see by like looking at like the empty land at Ellenor Street and other empty plots of land, like around this part of the city, that they don't replace it with anything, And so our demand is that every time you knock something down, you replace it with social housing, comparable social housing. So that's what we're fighting. We're fighting to keep hold of the social housing that we've got. We're also fighting to have the social housing that's been taken from us replaced by more social housing.
So we've got about a minute and a half on it. If there's anything else that you'd like to say to those watching from across Scotland, what would it be?
I think the most important thing is to know that housing associations, councils, they're not used to tenants organising.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to do anything particularly special. You just have to organise something, and it very often it puts the wind up them, and they respond, by accommodating you. And you can have, like, I think on the Wyndford we've had we're really punching like way above our weight for a small organisation, and you can do that too. The door is open, and of course, if anybody wants to contact us here at Wyndford Residents Union, we're always happy to talk to you about the situation in your area, or to speak at a meeting or whatever.
Well, many thanks for that, Eleanor. Obviously, a lot to digest there. And as I said, this is the first in a weekly series of broadcasts by the Scottish Tenants Organisation, Scottish Tenants News. So we'll be bringing you more interviews and features as time wears on. And I appreciate the time you've taken out your day, Eleanor, to be our first victim.
Thank you. Thank
you,
Nick.
With that, See you later.